Hi, it's Miss Dolores from Baldwin Borough Public Library. We are continuing another Two-Chapter Tuesday. Today we are joining with the Allegheny County Library Association to bring the program to anybody and everybody in the county. And we hope you're tuning in and can enjoy this recommendation for Two-Chapter Tuesdays. So today's recommendation is a series of books called The Land of Stories. This book series is very popular for, I would say, 3rd through 6th graders, but I always say that most books are for everybody. So if you're not at a reading level, you can see the book is a little bit bigger. If you're not at the reading level of 3rd grade yet, you can certainly read this book together with your parents in the evenings or anytime that you're anywhere. So today I'm back on my back porch, and this is one of my favorite reading places. So I come out here every night, and this is where I read my stories. So maybe you have a favorite reading place at your house or at a park or somewhere that you go that you might want to pick up this book. So if you're wondering what The Land of Stories is about, it is about twins Alex and Connor Bailey. And if you combine fantasy with fairy tales that you have grown up knowing, that is basically what these books are about. But it takes you on a really big super adventure with the twins, and there's like magic and fairy tales and characters from those fairy tales that they encounter, but in a fictitious and fantasy story. So today is book 1. I'm going to start with book 1. We're going to read the prologue, which is the chapter that comes before chapter 1. So that is the prologue. It kind of gives the overview of what the story is about. And then we will read all of chapter 1. And those will be our 2 chapters for today. And then if you would like to get this book, you could just go on to, you could ask your parents to go on to their account, and you could either call our library up and order it, or you can order it online, and you can pick it up at your library if your library is open, or curbside. So either way. So we're going to start. Book 1 is called The Wishing Spell. Okay, and inside the book they give you a really nice map, and you can see different places that will be mentioned in the story, and maybe some fairy tale character locations that you are familiar with. Okay, this is the prologue. It is called The Queen's Visit. The dungeon was a miserable place. Light was scarce and flickered from the torches bolted to the stone walls. Foul-smelling water dripped inside from the moat circling the palace above. Large rats chased each other across the floor, searching for food. This was no place for a queen. It was just past midnight, and all was quiet except for the occasional rustle of a chain. Through the heavy silence, a single step of footsteps echoed through the halls as someone climbed down the spiral steps into the dungeon. A young woman emerged down the steps, dressed head to toe in a long emerald cloak. She cautiously made her way past the rows of cells, sparking the interest of the prisoners inside. With every step she took, her pace became slower and slower, and her heart beat faster and faster. The prisoners were arranged according to crime. The deeper she walked into the dungeon, the crueler and more dangerous the criminals became. Her sights were set on the cell at the very end of the hall, where a prisoner of special interest was being watched by a large private guard. The woman had come to ask a question. It was a simple question, but it consumed her thoughts every day, kept her lying awake most nights, and was the only thing she dreamed about with a little sleep she managed. Only one person could give her the answer that she needed, and that person was on the other side of the prison bars ahead. "I wish to see her," the cloaked woman said to the guard. "No one is allowed to see her," the guard said, almost amused by the request. "I'm on strict orders from the royal family." The woman lowered her hood and revealed her face. Her skin was as pale as snow. Her hair was as dark as coal, and her eyes were as green as a forest. Her beauty was known throughout the land, and her story was known even beyond that. "Your Majesty, please forgive me," the stunned guard apologized. He quickly bent into an overly pronounced bow. "I wasn't expecting anyone from the palace." "No apology necessary," she said, "but please do not speak of my presence here tonight." "Of course," the guard said, nodding. The woman faced the bars, waiting for them to be raised, but the guard hesitated. "Are you sure you want to go in there, Your Highness?" the guard said. "There's no telling what she's capable of." "I must see her," the woman said, "at any cost." The guard began turning a large circular lever, and the bars of the cell rose. The woman took a deep breath and continued past them. She journeyed through a longer, darker hallway where a series of bars and barriers were raised and then lowered after she walked past them. Finally, she reached the end of the hall. The last set of bars were raised, and she stepped into the cell. The prisoner was a woman. She sat on a stool in the center of the cell and stared up at a small window. The prisoner waited a few moments before acknowledging the visitor behind her. It was the first visitor she had ever had, and she knew who it was without looking. There was only one person it could be. "Hello, Snow White," the prisoner said softly. "Hello, stepmother," Snow White replied with a nervous quiver. "I hope you are well." Although Snow White had rehearsed exactly what she wanted to say, she was now finding it nearly impossible to speak. "I heard that you are the queen now," her stepmother said. "It's true," said Snow White. "I've inherited the throne as my father intended." "So, to what do I owe this honor? Have you come to watch me wither away?" her stepmother said. There was such authority and power to her voice. It was known to make the strongest of men melt like ice. "On the contrary," Snow White said, "I have come to understand." "To understand what?" her stepmother asked harshly. "Why?" Snow White hesitated. "Why you did what you did." And with this finally said, Snow White felt a weight lift off of her shoulders. She had finally asked a question that had been so strongly on her mind. Half of the challenge was over. "There are many things about this world you don't understand," the stepmother said, and turned to look at her stepdaughter. It was the first time in a long time that Snow White had seen her stepmother's face. It was the face of a woman who had once possessed beauty without flaw, and the face of a woman who had once been queen. Now the woman sitting before her was just a prisoner, whose looks had faded into a permanent, sorrowful scowl. "That may be," Snow White said, "but can you blame me for trying to find some sort of reason behind your actions?" The recent years of Snow White's life had become the most scandalous of the kingdom's royal history. Everyone knew the story of the fair princess who'd taken refuge with the 7 dwarfs while hiding from her jealous stepmother. Everyone knew of the infamous poisoned apple and the dashing prince who had saved Snow White from a false death. The story was simple, but the aftermath was not. Even with a new marriage and a monarchy to occupy her time, Snow White found herself constantly wondering if the theories of her stepmother's vanity were true. Something inside the new queen refused to believe that someone could be so malicious. "Do you know what they're calling you out there?" Snow White asked. "Outside of these prison walls, the world refers to you as the evil queen." "If that is what the world has labeled me, then that is the name I shall learn to live with," the evil queen said. "Once the world has made a decision, there is little anyone can do to change its mind." Snow White was astonished by how little her stepmother cared, but Snow White needed her to care. She needed to know that there was some humanity left in her. "They wanted to execute you after they discovered your crimes against me. The whole kingdom wanted you dead." Snow White's voice faded to a faint whisper as she fought off the emotions building up inside of her. "But I wouldn't allow it. I couldn't." "Am I supposed to thank you for sparing me?" the evil queen asked. If you expect someone to fall at your feet and express gratitude, you have come to the wrong cell. I didn't do it for you, I did it for myself, Snow White said. Like it or not, you are the only mother I have ever known. I refuse to believe that you are the soulless monster the rest of the world claims you to be. Whether it's true or not, I believe there is a heart deep down inside of you. Tears rolled down Snow White's pale face. She had promised herself she would stay strong, but she had lost control of her emotions once she was in her stepmother's presence. Then, I'm afraid you're wrong, the evil queen said. The only soul I've ever had died a long time ago, and the only heart you'll find in my possession is a heart of stone. The evil queen did indeed have a heart of stone, but not inside her. A rock in the shape and size of a human heart was on a small table in the corner of the cell. It was the only item the evil queen had been permitted to keep when she was arrested. Snow White recognized the stone from her childhood. It had always been very precious to her stepmother, and the evil queen had never let it out of her sight. Snow White had never been allowed to touch it or to hold it, but nothing was stopping her now. She walked across the cell, picked it up, and curiously stared down at it. It brought back so many memories. All the neglect and sadness her stepmother had caused her as a child rushed through her. All my life, I only wanted one thing, Snow White said, your love. When I was a girl, I used to spend hours hiding in the palace just hoping you would notice I was missing, but you never did. You spent your days in your chambers with your mirrors and your skin creams and this stone. You spent more time with strangers and anti-aging methods than you did with your own daughter. But why? The evil queen did not answer. You tried to kill me 4 times, 3 of which you attempted yourself, Snow White said, shaking her head in disbelief. When you dressed as an old woman and came to me at the dwarf's cottage, I knew it was you. I knew you were dangerous, but I kept letting you in. I kept hoping that you would change. I let you harm me. Snow White had never confessed this to anyone, and she couldn't help but bury her face in the palms of her hands and cry after saying it. You think you know heartbreak? The evil queen said so sharply that it startled her stepdaughter. You know nothing of pain. You never received affection from me, but from the moment you were born, you were loved by the whole kingdom. Others, however, are not so fortunate. Others, Snow White, sometimes have the only loves they've ever known taken from them. Snow White didn't know what to say. What love was she referring to? Are you speaking of my father? Snow White asked. The evil queen closed her eyes and shook her head. Naive. You are so naive. It's such a privileged trait, she said. Believe it or not, Snow White, I had my own life before I came into yours. Snow White grew quiet and slightly ashamed. Of course, she knew her stepmother had had a life prior to marrying her father, but she had never considered what it had consisted of. Her stepmother had always been such a private person. Snow White never had reason to. Where is my mirror? The evil queen demanded. It's to be destroyed, Snow White told her. Suddenly the evil queen's stone became much heavier in Snow White's hand. Snow White didn't know if this was really happening or if she was just imagining it. Her arm became tired from holding the stone heart, and she had to put it aside. There's so much you're not telling me, Snow White said. There are so many things you've kept from me all of these years. The evil queen lowered her head and stared at the ground. She remained silent. I may be the only person in the world with any compassion for you. Please tell me it isn't going to waste, Snow White pleaded. If there are events in your past that influenced your recent decisions, please explain them to me. Still, there was no response. I'm not leaving here until you tell me, Snow White yelled, raising her voice for the first time in her life. Fine, the evil queen said. Snow White took a seat on another stool in the cell. The evil queen waited a moment before beginning, and Snow White's anticipation grew. Your story will forever be romanticized, she told Snow White. No one will ever think twice about mine. I will continue to be degraded into nothing but a grotesque villain until the end of time. But what the world fails to realize is that a villain is just a victim whose stories hasn't been told. Everything I have done, my life's work, and my crimes against you has all been for him. Snow White felt her heart grow heavy. Her head was spinning, and curiosity had taken over her entire body. Who? She asked so quickly that she forgot to hold back the desperation in her voice. The evil queen closed her eyes and let her memories surface. Images of places and people from her past flew out from the back of her mind like fireflies into a cave. There was so much she had seen in her younger years, so many things she wished she remembered, and so many things she wished to forget. I will tell you about my past, or at least the past of someone I once was, the evil queen said, but consider yourself warned. My story is not one that ends with a happily ever after. Okay, so that is the end of the prologue, and then we're going to go into chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called Once Upon a Time. Once upon a time, Mrs. Peters said to her 6th grade class, these are the most magical words our world has ever known, and the gateway into the greatest stories ever told. They're an immediate calling to anyone who hears them, a calling into the world where everyone is welcome and anything can happen. Mice can become men, maids can become princesses, and they can teach valuable lessons in the process. Alex Bailey eagerly sat straight up in her seat. She usually enjoyed her teacher's lessons, but this was something especially close to her heart. Fairy tales are much more than silly bedtime stories, the teacher continued. The solution to almost every problem imaginable can be found in the outcome of a fairy tale. Fairy tales are life lessons disguised with colorful characters and situations. The Boy Who Cried Wolf teaches us the value of a good reputation and the power of honesty. Cinderella shows us the rewards of having a good heart. The Ugly Duckling teaches us the meaning of inner beauty. Alex's eyes were wide, and she nodded in agreement. She was a pretty girl with bright blue eyes and short strawberry blonde hair that was always kept neatly out of her face with a headband. The way the other students stared at their teacher, as if the lesson being taught were in another language, was something Mrs. Peters had never grown accustomed to. So Mrs. Peters would often direct entire lessons to the front row where Alex sat. Mrs. Peters was a tall, thin woman who always wore dresses that resembled old, patterned sofas. Her hair was dark and curly and sat perfectly on the top of her head like a hat, and her students often thought it was. Through a pair of thick glasses, her eyes were permanently squinted from all the judgmental looks she had given her class over the years. Sadly, these timeless tales are no longer relevant in our society, Mrs. Peters said. We have traded their brilliant teachings for small-minded entertainment like television and video games. Parents now let obnoxious cartoons and violent movies influence their children. The only exposure to the tales some children acquire are versions by film companies. Fairy tale adaptations are usually stripped of every moral and lesson the stories were originally intended to teach and replaced with singing and dancing forest animals. I recently read that films are being created depicting Cinderella as a struggling hip-hop singer and Sleeping Beauty as a warrior princess battling zombies. Awesome, a student behind Alex whispered to himself. Alex shook her head. Hearing this made her soul hurt. She tried to share her disapproval with her fellow classmates, but sadly, her concern was not reciprocated. I wonder if the world would be a different place if everyone knew these tales in the way the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen intended them to be known, Mrs. Peters said. I wonder if people would learn from the Little Mermaid's heartbreak when she dies at the end of her real story. I wonder if there would be so many kidnappings if children were shown the true dangers that Little Red Riding Hood faced. I wonder if delinquents would be so inclined to misbehave if they knew about the consequences Goldilocks caused for herself with the 3 bears. There is just so much to learn and prevent for our futures if we just open our eyes to past teachings. Perhaps if we embrace fairy tales as much as we could, it would be much easier to find our own happily ever afters. If Alex had her way, Mrs. Peters would be rewarded with thunderous applause after each lesson she gave. Unfortunately, all that followed her classes was a mutual sigh of relief among the students, thankful that they were over. "Let's see how well you all know your fairy tales," the teacher said with a smile and began pacing the room. In Rumpelstiltskin, what did the young maiden's father tell the king that his daughter could spin hay into? Does anyone know? Mrs. Peters scanned the classroom like a shark looking for wounded fish. Only one student raised her hand. "Yes, Miss Bailey?" Mrs. Peters called. "He claimed he could spin hay into gold," Alex said. "Very good, Miss Bailey," Mrs. Peters said. If she had a favorite student, not that she would ever admit to having one, Alex would have been it. Alex was always eager to please. She was the definition of a bookworm. It didn't matter what time of day it was, before school, during school, after school, before bed. She was always reading. She had a thirst for knowledge, and because of it, Alex was usually the first person to answer Mrs. Peterson's questions. She tried her best to impress her classmates with every chance she got, putting extra effort into each book report and class presentation she was assigned. However, this usually annoyed the other students, and Alex was often teased for it. She constantly heard other girls making fun of her behind her back. She usually spent lunch alone under a tree somewhere with an open library book. Although she would never tell anyone, Alex was so lonely that sometimes it hurt. Now, can anyone tell me what the compromise was that the maiden made with Rumpelstiltskin? Alex waited a moment before putting her hand up. She didn't want to seem like a total teacher's pet. "Yes, Miss Bailey?" In exchange for turning the hay into gold, the maiden promised to give Rumpelstiltskin her firstborn child when she became queen, Alex explained. "That's a pretty steep deal," said a boy behind Alex. "What's a creepy old short man want with a baby anyway?" a girl next to him asked. "Obviously he couldn't adopt with a name like Rumpelstiltskin," another student added. "Did he eat the baby?" someone else asked nervously. Alex turned around to face her clueless peers. "You're all missing the point of the story," Alex said. "Rumpelstiltskin took advantage of the maiden because she was in need. The story is about the price of a bad negotiation. What are we willing to give up long-term in the future for something short-term in the present? Get it?" If Mrs. Peters could change her facial expression, she would have looked very proud. "Nicely put, Miss Bailey," she said. "I must say, in all my years of teaching, I've rarely come across a pupil with as much in-depth knowledge as—" A loud snore suddenly came from back of the classroom. A boy in the back row was slouched over his desk and drooling from the corner of his mouth, very much asleep. Alex had a twin brother, and it was moments like these that made her wish she didn't. Mrs. Peters diverted her attention to him like a paper clip to a magnet. "Mr. Bailey?" Mrs. Peters asked. He continued to snore. "Mr. Bailey?" Mrs. Peters asked again, kneeling down closer to him. He let out another enormous snore. A few of the students wondered how it was possible for such a loud noise to come out of him. "Mr. Bailey!" Mrs. Peters shouted in his ear. As if someone had lit a firework under his seat, Connor Bailey jumped back to life, almost knocking his desk over. "Where am I? What happened?" Connor asked in a panicked state of confusion. His eyes darted around the room while his brain tried to remember where he was. Like his sister, he also had bright blue eyes and strawberry blonde hair. His face was round and freckled and at the moment slightly mushed to one side, like a basset hound when it first wakes up from a nap. Alex couldn't have been more embarrassed by her brother. Besides sharing looks and a birth date, she and her brother couldn't have been more different. Connor may have had a lot of friends, but unlike his sister, he had trouble in school. Mostly trouble staying awake. "I'm so glad you could rejoin us, Mr. Bailey," Mrs. Peters said sternly. "Did you have a nice nap?" Connor turned bright red. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Peters," he apologized, trying to be as genuine as possible. "Sometimes when you talk for long periods of time, I doze off. No offense, I can't help it." "You fall asleep in my class at least twice a week," Mrs. Peters reminded him. "Well, you do a lot of talking," he said. Before he could stop himself from saying it, Connor knew it was the wrong thing to say. A few of the students had to bite their hands to stop from laughing. I recommend you stay awake while I teach, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters threatened. Connor had never seen anyone squint her eyes so tight without shutting them before. Unless you know enough about fairy tales to teach this lesson yourself, she added. I probably do, Connor said. Once again, he spoke without thinking. I mean, I know a lot about this stuff. That's all. Oh, really? Mrs. Peters never backed down from a challenge, and every student's worst nightmare was that that'd be her challenge. All right, Mr. Bailey, if you're so knowledgeable, answer this question. Connor gulped. In the original tale of Sleeping Beauty, how many years does the princess sleep before she is awoken by true love's first kiss? Mrs. Peters asked, studying his face. All eyes were on him, impatiently waiting for the slightest indication that he didn't know the answer. But fortunately for Connor, he did. 100, Connor answered. Sleeping Beauty slept for 100 years. That's why the castle grounds were covered in vines and stuff, because the curse affected everyone in the kingdom, and there was no one to garden. Mrs. Peters didn't know what to say or do. She frowned down at him, immensely surprised. This was the first time he had ever been correct when she'd put him on the spot, and she certainly hadn't expected it. Try to stay conscious, Mr. Bailey. Lucky for you, I used my last attention slip this morning, but I can always request more, Mrs. Peters said, and promptly walked to the front of the classroom to continue her lesson. Connor sighed with relief, and the red drained from his face. His eyes met his sister's. Even she was surprised he had gotten the answer right. Alex hadn't expected Connor to remember any fairy tales. Now, class, I want you all to get out your literature books. Turn to page 170 and read Little Red Riding Hood quietly to yourselves, Mrs. Peters instructed. The students did as they were told. Connor made himself as comfortable as possible at his desk and began reading. The story, the pictures, and the characters were all so familiar to him. Okay, so that is one of the parts of Chapter 2, and we're going to continue Chapter 2. One of the things Alex and Connor looked forward to the most when they were very young had been the trips to see their grandmother. She lived up in the mountains in the heart of the woods in a tiny house that could best be described as a cottage, if such a thing still existed. It was a long journey, a few hours by car, but the twins loved every minute of it. Their anticipation would grow as they traveled up the windy roads and through the endless trees, and when they crossed the yellow bridge, the twins would excitedly exclaim, "We're almost there! We're almost there!" Once they arrived, their grandmother would greet them at the door with open arms and hugs so tight they would almost pop. "Look at you two. You've both grown a foot since the last time I saw you," Grandma would say, even if they hadn't, and then would lead them inside where a freshly baked batch of cookies waited for them. Their father had grown up in the woods and would spend hours each day telling the twins his adventures as a kid. All the trees he'd climbed, all the streams he'd swum, and all the ferocious animals he'd barely escaped from. Most of his retellings were highly exaggerated, but they loved this time with him more than anything else in the world. "Someday, when you're older, I'll take you to all the secret places where I used to play," their father would tease them. He was a tall man with kind eyes that would wrinkle whenever he smiled, and he smiled quite a bit, especially when he was teasing the twins. At night, the twins' mother would help their grandmother cook dinner, and after they had eaten, as soon as the dishes were done, the family would sit around the fireplace. Their grandmother would open her big storybook, and she and their father would take turns reading the twins' fairy tales until they fell asleep. Sometimes the Bailey family would be up until sunrise. They told the stories with such detail and passion that it didn't matter how many times the twins heard the same story. They were the best memories any child could ask for. Unfortunately, the twins hadn't been back to their grandmother's cottage in a very long time. "Mr. Bailey!" Mrs. Peters shouted. Connor had dozed off again. "Sorry, Mrs. Peters," he bellowed back, sitting straight up in his seat like a soldier on guard. If looks could kill, Connor would have been dead from the scowl she was sending him. "What did we think of the real Little Red Riding Hood?" the teacher asked the class. A girl with frizzy hair and thick braces raised her hand. "Mrs. Peters," the frizzy-haired girl asked, "I'm confused." "And why is that?" Mrs. Peters asked. "What on earth could you possibly be confused about?" "Because it says the big bad wolf is killed by the hunter," the frizzy-haired girl explained. "I always thought the wolf was just upset because the other wolves in his pack made fun of his snout, and he and Little Red Riding Hood became friends in the end. At least that's what happened in the cartoon I used to watch when I was little." Mrs. Peters rolled her eyes as far back into her head as she could. "That," she said with a clenched jaw, "is exactly why we're having this lesson." The frizzy-haired girl became wide-eyed and sad. How could something so dear to her have been wrong? "For homework," Mrs. Peters said, and the room unanimously slumped in their seats, "you are to pick your favorite fairy tale and write a paper due tomorrow on the real lesson the tale is trying to teach us." Mrs. Peters went to her desk, and the students began working on their assignment with the little class time remaining. "Mr. Bailey," Mrs. Peters summoned Connor to her desk. "A word." Connor was in deep trouble, and he knew it. He cautiously stood up and walked to Mrs. Peters' desk. The other students gave him sorrowful looks as he walked by, as if he were walking to his executioner. "Yes, Mrs. Peters?" Connor asked. "Connor, I'm trying to be very sensitive about your family situation," Mrs. Peters said, glaring at him over the frames of her glasses. Family situation. 2 words Connor had heard too many times in the last year. "However," Mrs. Peters continued, "there is certain behavior I just will not tolerate in my classroom. You've constantly been falling asleep in class. You don't pay attention, not to mention you quiz and test very poorly. Your sister seems to be functioning just fine. Perhaps you could follow her example." It was a comparison that felt like a kick in the stomach every time someone made it. Indeed, Connor was not his sister by any means, and he was always punished because of it. "If this continues, I will be forced to have a meeting with your mother. Do you understand?" Mrs. Peters warned him. "Yes, sir. Ma'am, sorry, it just hadn't been his best day." "Okay, then. You may have a seat." Connor slowly walked back to his seat, his head hanging slightly lower than it had all day. More than anything, he hated feeling like a failure. Alex had watched the entire conversation between her brother and their teacher. As much as her brother embarrassed her, she did feel for him, as only a sister could. Alex flipped through her literature book, deciding on which story to write about. The pictures weren't as colorful and exciting as they had been in her grandma's book, but seeing all the characters she had grown up reading about made her feel at home, a feeling that had recently become a rarity. If only fairy tales were real, she thought. Somebody could wave a wand and magically make things how they used to be. Okay, so that is the end of the chapter. We are going to stop there. I really hope you check out The Land of Stories, The Wishing Spell. I meant to mention this book is written by Chris Colfer, and I failed to mention that in the beginning. So if you'd like to check it out, please order it. Please give us a call, 412-885-2255, to place the book on hold for you. Or you can check out this copy that I have that I will be returning tomorrow. So I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next Tuesday for another book and another 2-chapter Tuesday. Have a great week.